Hello, Abnormal Investigations. Good to see everybody. And I want to thank everybody for the good reports we've got back on our Patreon video. Everybody loved it, said it was well worth it, and you all enjoyed the deep dive we took. We definitely went deep, and I'm glad you all enjoyed it, and we're going to have a lot more of those videos I think we're going to be working on and putting out since it was so well received. Everybody loved it. They said it was one of the best videos we've ever produced. So thank you very much for your support. If you're interested in seeing it, the Patreon link will be in the description of this video. I've never told this story to anyone before. I don't want people to believe that I'm crazy. I'm a professional, and if anyone were to think this story or to link it to me, it would affect my practice. But despite that risk, I have to tell someone of this experience, even only if I have to do it anonymously. It happened back when I was 10 years old in the summer of 1979. Looking back, I had an ideal childhood, which is quite rare now. I'm from the Triad area of North Carolina, from an area that was relatively rural at the time. I was pretty much a free-range kid. So long as I was home for supper, there weren't any problems. Much of my time was spent playing in the woods and creeks within a mile or so of my home. Naturally, being a bit of a country boy, I was obsessed with the hunting and fishing, guns, bows, arrows, but especially deer hunting. I read hunting magazines all the time, soaking up everything I could about the habits of white-tailed deer, from when and where they moved, and what they are depending on in that time of year. Furthermore, I learned their seasonal diet and how to read their sign, from rubs, scrapes, spoor, and finding their trails. The experience I wish to relate did not occur in North Carolina, but up in Virginia. It is a memory that haunts me yet, and is something I will never be able to forget. As much as I enjoyed the woods and creeks of my home, my grandmother's place in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia was special. That was a wilderness compared to the woods at home. Her land in Carroll County was on the ridge, about 1.5 hours from home. It was just a 3-room cabin, then without a year-round running water. When the weather was good enough for the unpaved mountain roads to be drivable, we were able to go there on most weekends. I would spend most of the day roaming all across the mountain from the top of the ridge to the river below. The nearest neighbor was about a mile away on a state-maintained gravel road. But even the most of homes in that area were vacation homes and were normally empty. It was a Saturday in June, and school was about out for the summer. We would go up Friday evening and come back Saturday night. My grandmother was very devout and probably the sincerest Christian I have ever known. But it was Saturday morning, and I had the entire day to explore the mountain. By this time, I had a fairly decent grasp of the habits of the local deer population. Deer are most active at dawn and dusk, and when under pressure, such as during heavy hunting pressure, will become mostly nocturnal unless they're in a rut. But this was June, and hunting season was months away, and the rut was a couple of months after that. So I made my plans to explore the creek by following it into the river, then follow the river upstream to a big rock, then hike up a rather steep mountain back to the cabin, stopping for a rest in the shallow cave, then make it back to the cabin, about noon or something, to eat. Then I had to help my grandmother garden for a few hours. As you can imagine, that was a busy morning and afternoon. But at 10 years old, there was endless energy, and I had decided to take the binoculars and watch the recently timbered patch of land from the top of the ridge once my chores were done. I set off with the promise to get back just before it got too dark. The only real agriculture in those mountains was raising beef, hay, silage, and some cabbage. The apple orchards were mostly on the southern side of the Blue Ridge near the tourist areas. Most of what the deer ate around my grandmother's cabin at the time of year would have been tree or perennial browse, and any annuals such as pokeweed and other green leafy plants. They would also obviously eat any berries that were starting to come out around that time of year. There were a few hours of daylight remaining. Then I took off up the road with my binoculars and canteen and, of course, spring water. The wind had been blowing favorably all day. For those who don't know, While you may fool deer's eyes, you will not fool his nose. The wind decides pretty much everything when it comes to hunting deer. On this day, the wind was favorable. It was blowing at a crosswind to me, overlooking a cleared little valley. The cleared land went down to the creek, and it had timber all around it. It was lush and new growth for the deer to feast upon, but it was still low enough that an adult deer would be visible from my vantage point. At the top of the ridge, the other side of the creek remained in timber. Thick thickets of timber. I got settled in a good couple of hours before dusk. I wanted to sit there with plenty of time for the woods to calm down from my walk to be able to spot some deer from a long distance. I didn't want to spook any deer on the walk in, I said. I got settled into my spot, and I made it as comfortable and as good as I could, and I constructed a rough blind by placing some leafy branches into the ground to break up my outline, which took about 10 minutes. I stretched out and scanned the clear-cut area below, double-checking the likely areas to expect to see a deer to come out of the woods and the clearing to browse. I had just rested, enjoying the pleasant evening, watching birds and small animals. After about an hour and a half, the sun was starting to set, and I took one last drink of water until it started to get dark. Suddenly, there was a bit of movement down to my right. After scanning the area with the binoculars, I saw that it was a deer and a new fawn. The doe paused at the edge of the clearing to make sure it was safe, while occasionally checking her back trail. It then slowly moved out into the clearing quickly, followed by the fawn. It was a large doe with the fawn, which was not a surprise since older does tend to have one fawn while younger does more often will have two. But the two deer were not alone. Another deer followed them. The three deer slowly worked their way up the creek, eating and browsing as they did. The doe would pause to allow her fawn to suckle. It was beautiful. It was then that I noticed some movement on the opposite side of the hill. In the thicket there was movement. Something large was working its way down the hillside. The thicket was especially thick, and while I could not see what was moving through, its movement was caused the thicket itself to move. I assumed it was another deer. By this time, it was too close to being dark to be able to see really clearly. The three deer had taken about 30 minutes to work their way up the little creek from where they had been. The expected deer that I assumed had come through the thicket had never left the thicket and crossed the creek, through which led me to believe it was an old buck, since they're usually more cautious. By this time it was almost dark. Fortunately, through my binoculars, I gathered enough light that I could see what was going on. The binoculars magnified and made everything brighter. If I were not using the binoculars, I would not have seen what happened next. Often, then, since I wished that I did not have my binoculars that day, that I had left earlier, that I had not seen what I seen. The three deer reached a spot close to the last spot that I had seen the movement through the thicket. Just a moment after the deer again checked the back trail, there was a sudden commotion from the thicket. It was a large animal leaped out of the thicket, clearing the small creek. In one bounce, the doe was taken down on an instant. What appeared to be a large wolf had the doe's throat in its powerful jaws. Astounded, I watched, and what appeared to be a wolf kill its prey. Besides the fact that there haven't been any wolves in Virginia for about 150 years, I noticed, or that's what they say. The wolf's proportions appeared wrong. Its front legs were too long, its upper torso was too broad to be that of a canine. But then it only became more strange as the wolf's jaws crushed on the windpipe of the doe. I noticed that the front paws were not paws at all. They appeared to be more like hands than paws. Paws which were then holding down the deer in its death rattle. As the wolf-like animal dropped the deer from its jaws, it fell to the ground. The night action. It was what left me confounded until this day. The animal raised from its crouching position and stood on its hind legs to a height of, I'm guessing, around 7 foot. It looked around, including in my direction. It sniffed the air as it did so. Fortunately, the wind held steady and I was not downwind of it. I froze in terror. It did not see me. As the light faded, I could tell that the beast was grayish in color. Its fur was thicker around its neck and down its back. Its muzzle was pronounced, Its hind legs were too short in comparison to the front legs. While it was muscular, it was not overly so. The beast began tearing into the dough with its teeth. It was then that I decided a silent retreat was the best and sensible thing to do, as this thing seemed that it had been starving the way it was eating. Ripping, tearing, feasting, crunching, smacking. All I can say is I was ever so glad that I had made a decent blind to conceal my retreat, so that I was able to retreat unseen and relatively quiet. It was also fortunate that the beast was distracted by its meal. I returned to my grandmother's cabin under the constant fear of brutal death. I had never been happier to leave my grandmother's cabin than I was that summer. That was the last time I ever went there. My grandmother was not one to walk far from the cabin. I attempted to dissuade her from going on as many walks as she had, but my grandma passed away that year, and we was not able to return the next. I still wonder what lives out there and what I seen that day. Sounds like you seen a werewolf or a dogman, and it was hunting, and you just happened to have the wind and everything at your favor. It's probably a good thing it never seen or heard you, or you probably would have been in a run for your life. Thank you for listening, guys. Keep your head on a swivel. Don't be something's dinner, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you for smashing the like button and sharing us out. It helps so much, and thank you all so very much for your support.